We are very, very glad to welcome David Collins here tonight, all the way from Vancouver. His bio is on your handout, but let me just make a couple notes. He brings a wealth of experiences and expertise to our discussion tonight. He's been ambassador to 5 countries. He started as in the area of trade. He's a senior trade commissioner. He's done a lot of work with NATO, including the NATO expansion towards the Soviet bloc. He spent 3 years in Minneapolis. And even though he's retired now, he continues to take assignments for the Canadian government. So he was the interim Canadian ambassador to Kabul in 2013. He observed the presidential election in Ukraine in 2014. And just last year, he completed a tour with HSBC Singapore as the senior VP of Financial Crimes Compliance. So yes, we all start thinking of a recent happening there. So it means that there's an awful lot of ground that we can cover tonight. We are particularly pleased to have joining him on stage our own Jack Segal, who does not require much of an introduction. I'll just say that he is a senior American diplomat, retired, who also served in Kabul. He also served in NATO. He dealt a lot with Ukraine at the White House, and he has been to Canada. So there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So things that weren't covered here on stage, store those up. And without further ado, let me welcome the Honorable David Collins and our own Jack Segal. Thank you.
Nice to hear.
Good evening, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. It's great to see you. A great crowd tonight. And thank you for getting us started here. Where's the vodka?
Absolutely. Well, Jack, I'm not too sure after the warm-up show before me.
No, this is intimidating.
I'm going to compare well, but we'll see.
Well, the theme tonight, David, is Prime Minister Trudeau. We have a new Canadian government since this fall, and he's been in office now, I guess, almost 6 months. But if one looks back at the political campaign, it's a little mysterious how his qualifications led so many Canadians to vote for him. What do you attribute this change of government between the Harper government and this new Trudeau mania to?
Absolutely. Those of you who have some history with you will recall his father, Pierre Trudeau, who, as a relatively older chap, married a very glamorous lady who is Justin Trudeau's mother, and swept Canada by storm. And young Justin, with his wife, Sophie Gregoire, seems to be doing the same, not only in Canada, but also in the United States. You'll probably recall he visited Washington in March and was given absolutely first-class treatment by President Obama and the folks there. But from a Canadian point of view, I have to confess that the rise of the Liberal Party and his election with a strong majority government was a bit of a mystery to all of us. But to go back a bit, if you look at the Harper period, who was elected first in 26, had almost 10 years in power, the Conservatives were a very conservative government, right-wing in many ways, had a huge distrust of the professional public service. For those of you who may not know, in our public service, we're all professionals. We don't have the system that you have in the United States when government changes of firing the top tier of senior officials. So we often have continuity. But in the years that the previous Liberal government was in place, I think the Conservatives thought that the civil service was somehow a Guinean. And we started a very rocky relationship with the Harper government in 2006. And it went through, as policy changes occurred, which we'll discuss a bit tonight, I imagine, to the end where Mr. Harper really became kind of a nasty man, or at least in the view of the Canadian public. He didn't allow senior officials to speak out. He had very tight control of communications on behalf of his government. He was beset by scandals in our Senate on financial malfeasance and so on. And he himself just appeared to be a nasty chap as he fought the election last year on wedge issues. So one of the most serious being things like wearing niqabs and so on the part of Muslim women. And at the time, the Liberal Party had come through a system where they kind of ate their young for a while. Several leaders came and went, including Michael Ignatieff, a name you'll probably know, who's a very well-regarded academic at Harvard. He didn't last long. His predecessor was a chap called Stéphane Dion, as leader of the Liberal Party, who's in fact now back in government as our foreign minister. But the Liberals didn't really kind of get it together. They were not the official opposition in our last parliament. That honor went to a party called the New Democratic Party, which is sort of a socialist party, led by a chap called Tom Mulcair. And because of the, I guess, concern about conservatism, he won a number of seats in Quebec, rather by surprise, and they formed the official opposition. And he was a very effective opposition leader. So the Liberals actually, coming into last year's election, were the third party in our parliament. And somehow this charismatic young chap came almost out of nowhere. He was an MP. The party leadership thought that they needed an absolutely new broom, a different broom, a brighter broom. And he was elected party leader and started to captivate people by his youth, his magnetism, his what are now termed sunny ways, which was in direct contrast to a rather grumpy and tired Mr. Harper. And for reasons that will become apparent perhaps as we discuss it, the NDP, which never would have formed a government in my view, lost a lot of their support. And a lot of their support came to the Liberals and Mr. Trudeau. And I, in fact, one of my little things last year, I was polling, I don't know how you run it here when you have elections, but we have citizens running polling stations. So I ran a little group of 6 polling stations on election day, and I was amazed at how many people came in, and the view was not necessarily huge support for Trudeau, because he was a totally untried candidate. You know, his history was basically as a teacher, a surfboarder, skier, that sort of thing. He didn't have a huge track record as a leader, as somebody who knew what he was doing, and so on. But the bottom line was that it was basically anybody but Harper. And he and his party throughout the country, especially in Atlantic Canada, they got almost all the seats there. They did quite well in Ontario. Some of the seats that had been NDP in Quebec went Liberal. So by gosh, the morning after the election, he woke up with a majority. But in my view, as much of it was anti-Harper and his government as it was pro-Trudeau and his government. And while the sunny ways continue, and 6 months into his mandate, it's clear that the honeymoon still continues. He hasn't had too many tough issues to deal with yet, but that will come. And one of the things where he's going to have a honeymoon carrying on is interesting. Harper resigned as leader of the Conservative Party, which is to be expected. They have an interim leader, and I think they're having their convention to elect a new leader next year. But poor Mr. Mulcair, who's a very effective parliamentarian in opposition, just last weekend, his party decided to dump him because they ascribed the blame for the loss of the number of seats they occurred in the election they had to him personally. So he's staying on for up to 2 years while they undergo a leadership review. So you've got our 2 major parties in opposition with interim leaders, trying to find a new way, trying to find policies that might attract people in our next election, which will come in 2019. So Trudeau's got kind of a free ticket for now to make his mark and move some policy yardsticks forward. Whether we can do it or he can do it remains to be seen in some ways.
Well, right after his visit to Washington, he participated in the United Nations climate change event, and he made some statements that were pretty forward-leaning in terms of Canada changing its direction. Now, the prior government, the Harper government, very much promoted the coal sands operation in the north, and is that some indication then that he's going to pull back from that? Is his environmental policy going to be a very strong environmental policy, or is he hampered by the economic realities of what Canada produces?
Well, one of the hallmarks of the previous government was a lack of interest in multilateralism. And for those of you who know Canada's history, we've traditionally been very supportive of the United Nations, outfits like the Commonwealth, the Francophonie, of which we're part, NATO, that sort of thing. The Harper government wasn't too keen on that. They looked at foreign policy issues as transactional ones to be dealt with sequentially as they came and so on. They didn't really have a vision. One of the things that the Trudeau government stated up front, both in their campaign platform and following the election, was that we would re-engage with the international community through agencies such as the United Nations and work from within rather than trying to pick bones with them from without. And as part of that, of course, climate change is one issue rose very large. So you're absolutely right, Jack. The policy that Trudeau will follow on climate change is much more progressive than the Conservatives have, and he showed that in Paris. And I think this week, and if not tomorrow, in New York, we're signing the Paris Convention that emanated from that. In Canada, energy issues, environmental issues are contentious as much as they are here. One of the anomalies at the moment, of course, in this time of economic downturn in the energy sector, is that Alberta, which is our economic powerhouse on the energy side, is now run by an NDP, a New Democratic Party / socialist government. And one would think, of course, they would be very anti-energy sector, very much pro-environment, and they are. But of course, they realize in a practical way that one has to generate economic growth, generate revenue, and in that province it comes from energy in many, many ways. So the trick will be for Trudeau as he moves ahead, and you may recall that he and President Obama discussed climate change extensively during the visit in March in Washington. The trick will be to balance legitimate environmental concerns in the oil sands and elsewhere with what we need to do to generate progressive development and income and try to satisfy all sectors. Not easy to do. But certainly there's a firm commitment that this government will move ahead on climate change and environment generally in a far more productive way than perhaps the previous government did.
Now, another area that may be a big contrast is particularly during our election campaign, has been the issue of immigration. And there, Prime Minister Trudeau has really taken a leading role, certainly for North America, saying that you'll take in 25,000 Syrian refugees, and there's another 10,000 coming next year. How do you explain that difference? I mean, what is it about the Canadian approach that we are missing here?
Well, I think, I don't want to sound like Pollyanna here, but Canada's always had a reputation of being welcoming to immigrants, trying to do good in the world, quote unquote. And I think because the whole issue of immigration, especially dealing with Islamic migrants, became such a wedge issue in the election, Trudeau went out on a limb a bit to be as supportive as he could in response to what was and is clearly a humanitarian disaster in the Middle East. And claimed that by Christmas we would take in, or by the end of the year, we'd take in 25,000 Syrian migrants, refugees. We did that pretty much into January. We've got the 25,000 in, and as you say, in 2016 we're looking at another 10,000. Now, you have to put it, I think, in context of humanitarian interest and social justice on the one hand. The other factor, too, is that a lot of it, and it may be by chance given circumstances that this Syrian influx occurred as it has, but there are many Canadian provinces that are slowly dying because they don't have enough people. I come from Nova Scotia in eastern Canada, and there are more people dying there each year than are being produced by natural causes. So immigration in terms of economic well-being is in fact the only option we have. That pertains particularly in East Coast Canada, but across the country as well, as we all age and that sort of thing. The baby boomers are getting older. So we see a need for immigration. It's just a fact, an absolute fact. So in this case, that kind of economic necessity of trying to increase our population to sustain it, juxtaposed with the humanitarian complexity of it all, managed to coincide in having a signature policy of taking in these Syrians. Now, obviously, it's not without some challenges. Security is one of them. We've done as best we can, and we're satisfied that the security vetting that occurred with the Syrians overseas, of the ones who we've brought in, is as good as it possibly can be. I don't want to overstate that, but we do have communities in Canada, like you do here, where some Muslims have been radicalized in Canada, and we've homegrown some own terrorists and so on. We've had a couple of incidents in Canada of people doing one-off acts of terrorism. We've had Canadians going overseas, both in Eastern Africa and Somalia, and in the Middle East to fight jihad and so on. So it's not foolproof, and I wouldn't want to suggest it is. But we're satisfied that we did the best we could in looking at this current influx. Canada, like the United States, has a number of agencies who look at this sort of stuff pretty intensively. So we're encouraged on that. The issue for me always has been is the integration factor. And some communities integrate better than others. For example, the precedent that a lot of people cite in Canada for what we're doing with Syrians is what we did with Vietnamese back in the 70s. We took something like 60,000+ Vietnamese. And they, by and large, have integrated very well. And in some cases, they're now down starting the third generation, and they're totally Canadianized, if I can say that. We don't quite have the melting pot that you do. We do encourage our ethnic groups to maintain their own identity. We're multicultural in that sense. Excuse me, and sometimes that impedes the integration process in the community. For example, in Toronto, we have something like 200,000 Pakistanis where I served for 3 years. And you can go into that part of Toronto where they live in Mississauga and live happily in Urdu and not hear an English word spoken. So that's not great for the integration. And one of the problems, too, is, of course, naturally, migrants go to where the jobs are. And they tend to be in major urban centers, around Montreal, around Toronto, around Vancouver. So we need some of these folks to go, as I said earlier, in rural Nova Scotia or northern Saskatchewan. They're hugely attractive to these people. And because they come in such numbers, they tend to form small g ghettos of their own people, where naturally they find support. I mean, one of the challenges now with our Syrian friends is, the vast majority of them are Arabic speaking. Some have some French, some have some English, but not a lot. So we're scurrying around trying to find interpreters for these people as they settle in to, access social services and that sort of thing. We're having to provide interpreters in schools, where these kids are starting out, or their kids are starting out. And that puts some stresses on the system as well. But if you look back, as I said, to the Vietnamese experience, the numbers we're taking in at the moment are not so huge as to be unabsorbed. For example, my son serves in the Canadian Army, and his base, his garrison in Kingston, Ontario, prepared some barracks to receive migrants in case they needed an interim home as they were getting settled. And the barracks were not used. Groups that were bringing in Syrians, either private sponsored groups or those sponsored by the government, were found more permanent accommodation quite quickly. So touch wood, it's working so far. We'll see how it all goes. But I think in part because of the humanitarian aspect of it, we're doing the right thing because we think it is, and of course the right thing to do. And if you look at the pressure that Europe is under with so many of these people, there are some European countries, as you know, that are, I wouldn't say collapsing, but have greater challenges in absorption than we do. We wanted to contribute something, and that's what we chose to do. So we'll see how it all works out. But as you say, Jack, it's in direct contrast to what the experience has been in the United States
Well, when
so
you
far.
look at 35,000 for the 2-year period, to extrapolate that on comparative populations, you have 32 million roughly. In Canada, we have 320 million here, so we would be taking in 350,000 Syrians in the United States. And that number is incomprehensible to an American audience, yet that would be much less than what the Germans took in, which was already 1 million.
I mean, there are concerns, of course, about this integration. I mean, we, like you, took in a bunch of Somalis from the 90s onward, and there are Somali communities in Ottawa and in Edmonton, for example, and we've had some integration problems with that community. We don't quite know why they find it hard to get on with it, and some of their young people feel alienated and not part of it, and there's certainly discrimination against them. Can't say that doesn't occur occasionally, but one hopes that any of these community groups, when they come, will want to embrace the best of the country they're coming to, whether it's Canada or the United States, and try to latch on to our values and hopes and so on, and not want to create their own community from which they can fight the problems back home and that sort of thing.
Now, in another area that you mentioned previously of multilateralism, it leads you to a question of trade. And during the Harper period, there was some complaining that under the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, Canada didn't have a role, didn't have a big enough role, or wasn't satisfied with its role. What do you foresee for the Trudeau government? Are they going to promote TPP, and assuming that the United States continues to pursue it as well? Is that something that is popular in Canada? Because we get this big argument going now of it being a job killer for our society.
Well, it won't surprise you, of course. Canada's a trading nation, and still our largest market by far in the world is our trade with the United States, both ways. The previous government engaged on a couple of smaller trading deals with hot countries like Colombia, Korea, which they pursued. In the latter days of that administration, we negotiated a comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the European Union, which is continuing, and we're in the final period of trying to ratify it. Ironically, being held to ransom there. If you took a look at non-tariff barriers, non-trade barriers, one of the aspects in the European Union, of course, is fair mobility of people. We still levy or have visa requirements for citizens of Romania and Bulgaria, which are members of the European Union, and they threatened to veto the European participation in this agreement if we don't open up Canada to their people. So the threat at the moment, which is on the table, is that the European Union will impose visas on Canadians going to Europe if we don't sort of smarten up on these Bulgarians and Romanians. There's still some room for negotiation and all that, so we'll see how it occurs. But that agreement's hugely comprehensive. It mirrors a bit the one your government has with the European Union as well. The TPP, interestingly, is an agreement that was long in gestation. I was serving in Malaysia when it first sort of reared its head. We came to the party somewhat late, and decided after thoughtful contemplation that we probably couldn't be out of it, given the fact that we are a Pacific country. But it was not unalloyed pleasure, and there's lots of criticism in Canada about what we negotiated. One of the challenges, which of course will resonate in Michigan for you as it does for us, is effect on the auto industry. And of course our Japanese car manufacturing friends want their stuff to enter duty-free, and there was huge discussion about, okay, is a Japanese car Japanese if it has 40% of Chinese parts in it, and how do they come in, and all this sort of thing. And of course our unions are saying we're giving away jobs, Canadian jobs, to the Japanese if we carry on with this. The other little secret that Canada has, which was tough to negotiate, was something that we call supply management, where in sectors such as dairy and poultry, we essentially subsidize, there's no other word for it, we subsidize the producers in those areas. So for example, a bottle of milk that would cost $1 in Vermont costs $2 in Canada because of the way the subsidy system works. And we do it in, frankly, areas of the country which are sensitive politically, and the government wants to keep people sweet. So we've never actually put this supply management program on the table and negotiated it away, which is what most of our trade partners do. I think this government, they've said they're reviewing TPP. They did not renounce it immediately, as they have a couple of other policies, such as procurement of the F-35 fighters, the fifth-generation fighter for our Air Force. So it's on the table, being negotiated. I think we're kind of watching to see what happens in the United States, whether there are any other rumbles. The other big interesting aspect I think about TPP, of course, is at the moment it excludes China. And China's got its own new economic area underway with its friends. But most people think if the TPP will work properly downstream, it will have to include China in some form. So that's an area that's worth watching. But the reality is, I think, that if you believe, for example, in North American Free Trade Agreement, yes, there have been some job losses in certain sectors, but in terms of increasing the bilateral trade, not only between Canada and the U.S., but the inclusion of Mexico has been generally beneficial for all of us in terms of increasing the volume of trade. So TPP offers that too. Where the devil in the detail will be is there are a number of side agreements which were set aside in the main negotiation to be negotiated between particular countries on certain issues. And of course, that level of detail can rent it all asunder depending how people move ahead on it. But at the moment, our priority seems to be trying to conclude the European agreement before it unravels over things like this visa issue.
Well, you live in Western Canada. Is there, I remember earlier in the Obama administration, the idea of a pivot to Asia. And I've read articles about the large numbers of Chinese who have come to your area of Canada with their very rich children, buying supercars and enjoying themselves there. Is there a sentiment that the future for Canada rests in Asia, or is it still focused on the European Union and Europe and the transatlantic connection?
Well, of course, some would argue that the transatlantic connection is not as important as it should be. For example, the area of defense, we're a member of NATO, have been since 1949, proudly so by and large. But people argue that the game, and it's not just security, but politically, economically, is in Asia Pacific. And people also argue that if we truly think that we're a Pacific country, we've got to do more in that part of the world. Sadly, the rhetoric outstrips the action on the part of our government and business by and large over years. I've served in both Malaysia and South Korea. And in certain sectors, like telecom, some resource-based issues, some Korea, cars again, shipbuilding and so on, there are spots where we can do things together. But China, which of course is so important to all of us, a lot of Canadian companies who, by and large, look to the United States for their bread and butter, when they start dealing overseas with countries like China, they get bitten pretty quickly. You need deep pockets, you need strong resolve to do business, and we have too few international companies of that nature who can profit well in a market like China and kind of play the game as they want. For example, on the pivot stuff, we moved we have a very small Navy compared to yours, but we moved several destroyers from the East Coast to the West Coast to show interest that we want to be more visible in the Pacific. Whether we want to get involved in some gun battle in the South China Sea with China over the Spratly Islands or something remains to be seen. We just don't have that sort of firepower or interest. And ironically, too, you mentioned our Chinese population, of which there are many and they keep coming in fewer numbers than they did. But a lot of the influx of Chinese, we've had waves over the last century. Some came to build the railways in the 19th century. The current lot's genesis was getting out of Dodge before Hong Kong was handed back to the Chinese in 1997. And a lot of Chinese, because of, I guess, the Commonwealth connection, applied to come to Canada. We allowed them to do so, and we had a program then with anybody with, I think, minimally $500,000 could come and invest that in Canada, either by creating a new business or buying a business, and they get visas for their whole family and come on over. Well, many did that, bought houses, got launched, stayed around long enough for them to gain a Canadian passport. I don't want to sound cynical, but this is true. And they discovered that our taxation system was so high, most of them bailed out and went back to Hong Kong, where the tax rate was 10% compared to 35 or 40%, which they'd have to pay in Canada. But they still had the blue passports in their back pocket. So some of them come and go. I mean, one of the criticisms in Vancouver these days is that the condos downtown are empty. They're owned by Canadians or other immigrants from Asia, but who live elsewhere and just hold those as an investment and an interest. And have jacked up the prices that in cities like Vancouver, it's virtually unaffordable for your average folk to buy a house. But the pivot idea and the interest in Asia has never really caught on to the extent it should in Canada. Whether it reflects our history, our culture, I'm of an Anglo-Saxon background, so ties to Europe are still pretty strong. In another generation, they'll weaken for people like me as more and more other people have come to Canada, and Anglo-Saxons types will become a minority in Canada. But whether that'll force an interest in Asia, I'm not too sure. Most Asians left Asia because they didn't like it. They're looking for economically better life. They were fleeing conflict or whatever. And apart from the few who agitate back in their home territories, most don't, they have a nostalgic interest, but they don't agitate much to go back and live that sort of life. How all these people will end up contributing to the new Canada will be very interesting to follow.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the connections, of course, to Europe, and you played a key role as part of the international staff of NATO in the enlargement of NATO, and you also were involved, including serving in Kabul, where the Canadian forces, if you're not aware to this audience, they took the highest losses of any of the military forces in Afghanistan by percentage or by per capita, I guess. They were serving in the most dangerous part of Afghanistan, and they did that with great distinction. But Canada gets a lot of criticism because you're not investing much in your defense establishment. That seems to be a problem for the Trudeau government because there are a lot of other social priorities that would take precedence over this very expensive business of beefing up your military. What do you foresee in the next year or so, or longer term, that the government is going to try to do in the defense area?
Well, I have to say right up front that Canadian governments of whatever hue, conservative or liberal, have never thought that they could get many votes on the defense file. Canadians support their military, but when it comes to spending money, we're a bit more reluctant. Money goes into our social programs and that sort of thing. So governments can get away with a lot of rhetoric without actually having to commit much. Now, there's spikes on that. You may recall that Canada, under Prime Minister Chrétien, did not join President Bush's foray into Iraq. We just said, no, not for us. We don't like the intelligence. We don't like this. We don't like that. Just said, we're not participating. So that that didn't earn us much credit in the White House at the time, I have to say. And in part, perhaps, it fueled why we did contribute militarily in Afghanistan. Another, I don't want to say mistake, but I think we bit off more than we could chew. And as part of that, Jack referred to the number of military we had there. We had a brigade group down in the south in Kandahar, which saw a lot of very hard fighting alongside U.S. Marine Corps troops by and large. And we took a number of casualties. Canadians were proud of what we did. We spent $1 billion in Kandahar province through our provincial reconstruction team, building schools, improving this, improving that, and so on. When I was in Kabul, it was so dangerous after our forces withdrew that we couldn't even send anybody down there to see how our projects were doing. We had to have Afghan proxies, NGOs that we hired, to go and check on our projects as the Taliban encroached over what we did and kicked the girls out of the schools and wouldn't let them participate in society and so on. So after that experience, I have to say, Canadians are a bit weary of adventurism overseas, if I can say that. Now, in terms of defense policy for today, the Trudeau government, as they, in the recent budget, increased spending on infrastructure as kind of economic stimulus. They've increased spending on social programming. The middle class, whatever that means in Canada, is getting all sorts of benefits such as child tax credits and that sort of thing to try and help them out a bit. Folks at the top end of the economic spectrum are being taxed more. The Minister of Defense has said that he's not going to reduce the size of the relatively small Canadian forces. But that kind of leaves us in the position of where we are now, which is an army which needs some re-equipping after being tired out of 6 hard combat years, 10 total, but 6 combat years in Afghanistan. The Navy that's rusting out. We're just coming to the end of a conversion program for our 12 frigates. We need replacements of those in part. We're so desperate on at-sea supply capability. We've hired ships from Chile and supply, from Spain rather, as interim oilers for our fleet. The Air Force is looking for a new generation fighter. We've invested very much, as you have, in the F-35. There are now rumors that this government thinks that the F-35, sadly, is just unaffordable for a country like Canada, and we're going to open up that project again to competition. All this means that the whole defense procurement side, for example, just shifts to the right. And the money that was earmarked for procurement is shifted to the right as well, in part to pay for some of these social programs. In the wider international context, we've not been very good at NATO either in the last 5 years. We withdrew from a couple of programs such as Allied Ground Surveillance and the AWACS program, which is air surveillance. And we've been quite critical of NATO from an internal point of view and how the place is organized, how the budgets are allocated, trying to trim it down and that type of thing. And in fact, not that percentage of GNP is necessarily a useful barometer by which one can judge defense spending. The NATO criteria is 2%, and I think there are only about 3 countries that make that, the United States being one, Britain being another. Canada spends just 1%, depending how you count it, of our GNP on defense generally. So we're always chivied up by governments, even yours, to try and do more and do better. And we want to be, and one of the underpinnings of the new government is to bring Canada back into the mainstream. Whereas, you know, the Harper government was a bit reticent on foreign policy stuff. We want to be seen as, you know, happy helpers in the world, not only on peacekeeping, which used to be one of our forts, but the other thing which the current foreign minister calls responsible conviction. Now, we're not too sure what that means, but it's basically do the right thing for the right reasons, I guess. When it comes up, we'll look hard at what we want to do and where we want to do. But responsible conviction is where we will play. There's no evidence yet that on the wider security and defense front, we will take a larger role than we have in recent history. And that disappoints some, but not your mainstream Canadian who wants to see his or her money spent elsewhere. We'll see how that develops, but it'll be a slow period for the next years as the government has decided in its first mandate to focus on stimulus through infrastructure and social spending.
Now, I want to give the audience a chance, but let me just finish with a couple short questions. We've learned during our political campaign here in the States that your health care system is terrible, that you have long waits to see specialists, that there's rationing and end-of-life care, and it costs you a fortune. So why do Canadians tolerate such a lousy service when they could have all that we have in terms of inexpensive, timely, and well-served health care here? Why do you tolerate that?
Well, we've had our version of Obamacare in Canada for 50 years, and it's not perfect. And it's not perfect not because of how the system's organized, and it is becoming more expensive as it is everywhere, but where our challenges arise are the lack of medical professionals that the system can fund. I mean, in my city, which is kind of a bit like Traverse City, a lot of people come and retire to West Coast Canada. And, you know, friends sort of ring you up and say, my GP, my general family doctor, has announced his or her retirement. 1,000 people get a letter saying, I'm out of business, have a nice day. And there's just no doctor who will take on the responsibility of family practice. So what we developed are sort of group practices, family clinics, and people end up steered there, but don't get the kind of personal coverage that people would like. We're best on critical care. And if someone has a crisis, whether it's heart or cancer or whatever, the system really does turn to and help them out. If you've got gout in your left big toe, no one's too interested in that. You've got to tough it out on your own somehow. But we do spend a lot on that. But I wanted just to go back to the security thing for a while in terms of where Canada spends its money. Our former Deputy Prime Minister had a great little phrase that whenever Canada was at the table and the bill came around, we excused ourselves to go to the washroom. Some of that applies in the healthcare sector too.
Well, I guess the last issue, since you talked about the large amount of integration that you've invited into Canada, we had a presentation on this stage by Ambassador Pickering, who you know, about the effects of political campaigning on diplomats who are serving overseas. And when Canadians look at the rise of Donald Trump as a likely candidate, my question is, will Canada pay for its wall?
Well, I'm not too sure in this particular case. If Mr. Trump is elected president, we might pay for a wall to keep he and his crowd out of Canada. But it's an interesting thing because one of the planks of the new government, in fact, has announced publicly that we want to re-engage in a more productive way with the United States. Obviously, we engage in so many ways every day, people to people, academic institution to academic institution, other bilateral ties. So one can never say we're estranged, really. But one of our prime ministers years ago, I think it was Lester Pearson, said that, of course, or maybe it was Trudeau Sr., living next to the United States is like having an elephant in your room. Every time it twitches and grunts, you feel it somehow. And that's very true. And under the previous administration, because Mr. Harper took issue with lots of things that Mr. Obama, President Obama, was doing, they didn't have a very warm relationship at all. And if you'll recall, Harper went out big time to support the Keystone Pipeline, which your president finally denied last year after 6 or 7 years of evaluation. And that kind of cooled their relationship even more. Trudeau said, one particular project is not going to define our relationship between the two countries. And he wants to reestablish at an official senior level the sort of warm relationship we've traditionally had. And one mark of that, of course, was the recent visit he and his wife made to Washington, where they were very well received and talked about climate change. We need to, for example, renegotiate the softwood lumber agreement between our two countries. There are lots of other issues. Whether it plays out or not, I don't know, because the reality of life is, it's nice that Mr. Trudeau and President Obama, schmooze in Washington, but in 8 months, President Obama isn't going to be there, whoever is going to replace him. But I think it can be said pretty confidently that Canadian governments have traditionally got on better with sort of centrist democratic leadership than they have with right-wing Republicans. And the Trudeau Liberal government is center-left slightly. I don't want to paint them as socialists or anything, but they're center-left. So I suspect, walls notwithstanding, they might feel more at home with President Clinton, for example, than a President Trump. But we'll wait and see. In the meantime, we just stay up there north of the border and marvel at the theater that goes on in the United States.
Let's give the audience an opportunity. We have microphones available to you, so please stand if you can and wait for the microphone because we are recording for YouTube, and we welcome your questions.
Water? Thank you.
You mentioned China and the South China Sea. What about Russia and the Northwest Passage?
Good question.
Well, the Northwest Passage is interesting because, of course, it's going to start to be opened up to proper commercial navigation pretty soon with global warming and so on. It's accessible more often and earlier and that sort of thing. Canada is an active member of the Arctic Council, as is Russia, and of course we believe that the Northwest Passage lies in Canadian territories. Some other governments not too far from us here would argue it's an international waterway and should be treated as such. One of the problems with Russia generally is that given the stance Mr. Putin takes in how he progresses foreign affairs is that it's very aggressive and very triumphant on his part. And we see that in terms of how he deals on the security front, how he's dealt in Libya, how he's dealt in Syria, the recent confrontation, if I can say that, where Soviet jets have buzzed U.S. warships near the Baltics and so on. He's playing, of course, in part to a domestic audience, and part of his strength comes from bolstering up his own people who believe in the might of Mother Russia and how Russia can be great again in the imperial tradition of Catherine the Great and other czars. In the Northwest Passage sort of issue, in the Arctic generally, our concerns are one, peaceful use of the Arctic, and also environmental concerns, because if we start sending huge tankers through the Northwest Passage, there runs a risk of a tremendous catastrophe were it to occur. But of course, from a shipping point of view from Asia to Europe, if the Northwest Passage could be properly commercialized, it would cut the shipping time hugely, and therefore save money depending on where you sit and so on. One of the, just this week, there was a NATO-Russia Council in Brussels, a meeting And they went on chat. I don't think they agreed too much, but at least they're chatting, which is a good thing. And one of the other pillars of our new government is to reestablish lines of communication between Canada and countries like Russia and Iran as well. We closed our embassy in Iran a few years ago because we were cross with the Iranians for all the reasons you would understand. Post-sanctions, we're starting to lift some of those after the nuclear agreement. For a while, the Harper government ordered our embassy in Moscow not to talk to Russian officials because we were mad at Mr. Putin. Well, that's great, but what the hell they did day in, day out if they weren't allowed to talk to their host government, I'm not too sure. But when I ran, quote unquote, the NATO-Russia Council when I last served in NATO, and it always used to amaze me because we'd have meetings every couple times a year. And in those days, NATO, it was on the defense side of the business, but the NATO team that would meet with Russia were basically international civil servants, diplomats, supported by military in the back. The Russian team was always led by the military, the guys with these big hats, with a couple of diplomats at the back. And you sensed when you were in these meetings that we were coming at it from an entirely different perspective. And the Russian one was, of course, to show strength and so on. And that hasn't really changed too much. So my view, generally speaking, dealing with Russia, is that one does need to be firm. Not confrontational, not brinkmanship, but you can't take too much crap from them without pushing back a little bit and saying, yes, you have interests, we understand those, but no, the countries in the former Soviet Union don't need to be under your suzerainty forever. They have right of self-determination too if they want to. But Russia bears some watching, and Mr. Putin is potentially still a very dangerous man.
Microphone, please. Yeah.
Here in Michigan, we have been following in our provincial way the progress on the international trade bridge between Windsor and Detroit, which would be, we're told, a huge boon to international trade between our countries. I hope maybe you might have something to say about that.
Well, sadly, that project over the last 5 years has been mired in controversy because of the owners of the Ambassador Bridge, who, of course, were very reluctant to see a new link developed. Our argument has been all along in Canada that the Windsor-Detroit connection between our two countries, which sees just millions of truckloads of stuff going over every day. The amount of trade that passes there is phenomenal. And the poor old Ambassador Bridge just couldn't cope with it anymore in an efficient way. And one of the reasons we wanted to pursue the new bridge, which as some of you will know, of course, is going to be named the Gordie Howe Bridge, who I gather had some connection here in Traverse City. Opens up a whole opportunity for us to do more business together in an efficient way. And we were so persuaded of that we're building the Customs Plaza on a Canadian public-private engagement, so it's at no cost to the taxpayers of Michigan. But, God bless Mr., I can't remember his name, Murren, who runs the Ambassador Bridge. He will still do good business and the Ambassador Bridge will carry on, but just the sheer volume and the demand for transborder trade done in a special way does speak well to the cooperation that we have between our two governments in moving this ahead, and it is now finally moving ahead. So I think it's a positive move on my part, my view.
Right there.
Yeah, hi. You briefly touched on the NAFTA, I think, and the TPP. I was wondering if Canada would have the same concerns as we might have here. One of when we talk about the international trade agreements, we typically talk about jobs and job loss and things like that. There has been an incident, and we've had them here. I think it was Montreal that wanted to put in solar power or something like that, and they wanted to use all Canadian material and labor. And I guess the World Trade Organization sued Montreal for trying to do that. And which is, I believe that's a result of NAFTA and agreements like that. Something I worry about more, because I believe also that Michigan takes garbage from Canada, and we can't regulate that because of international trade agreement too. That's something that worries me more than it does, or as much as loss of jobs and things like that, is losing our national sovereignty. The threat is also exists still today. The Keystone may fall under that also, because it's international trade to allow the pipeline to go through and things like that. So does that also present the same kind of threat to Canada?
It's interesting you raise that. By the way, I hope that the quality of garbage we send from Canada to Michigan is, meets your landfill requirements. But yes, the whole issue of trade, and I'll answer this in a funny way. Canada, as you know, is a confederation. We have 10 provinces, or 10 provinces, 3 territories. And when our founding fathers, called the Fathers of Confederation, put our little show together back in 1867, they envisaged a very strong federal government with relatively weaker provinces. Well, through a century and a half of judicial interpretation, what we have today are, in fact, very strong provinces relative to the federal government, quite the reverse of what you had in all the way. But one of the things of this is, in terms of regulation for interprovincial commerce and so on, it is tougher, would you believe, to do some things between our provinces, like ship garbage, whatever, allow tradesmen to work in one province from another, than it is from Canada to the United States. For example, if you went up to Winnipeg next week and bought a trunk load of booze, it would be illegal to take that booze from Manitoba into Ontario, next door. So we have problems on interprovincial trade. You're right, under international agreement, things are negotiated, whether it's under NAFTA, about what we can do, what we can't do, the transfer of people. For example, I wasn't too sure when I entered the United States the other day whether I should declare to the U.S. Border Protection chappie that I was coming here to give a little talk in Michigan. Because he might have said, oh, you're coming down here to work. I'm not too sure that's legitimate. Have you filed this form, that form, and all the rest? So there are still inhibitions on some stuff on transborder. Pipelines, of course, yes, and we have them already, so they're in existence. Pipelines suffer more, I think, from environmental concerns than they actually do international trade concerns. And one of the challenges on that, of course, is to try and ensure environmental protection and adequate safeguards to allow economies to run properly. Although the pipeline business may not do too well overall, because one of the interesting little facts that I recalled the other day, would you believe, Canada sells as much gasoline or oil to the United States as the United States sells to Canada. So at the end of the day, it's a zero, it zeroes out. Now what that means, basically, we bring oil from Canada to the United States, you refine it here, and then sell it back to us as gasoline. But at least in the North American Free Trade Agreement, there are bilateral panels which can adjudicate a lot of the problems that come up. And I think they've been fairly managed over the years. You know, there are swings and roundabouts and all these things. Some winners, some losers. The garbage business I'm not too sure about, but you may well be sending some garbage up into Ontario as well. I'll check that out, sir, and come back to you.
Okay. Last call.
Hi, I'd like to address the most shocking development in the last couple of weeks between our two countries, and that's the fact that for the very first time there's not a single Canadian team in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And so what's a Canadian to do in this circumstance?
Well, I hope no one would raise that because I know you just want to embarrass me as a Canadian. Yeah, no, it is absolutely shocking for us, and there are a lot of disappointed people in Canada. You know, we still do play hockey, even though most of our teams seem to be populated by Czechs and Finns and that sort of thing. The old Canadian myth of hockey players starting out in the pond in the back of the farm in Saskatchewan isn't as strong as it used to be. But yeah, this year we took a bit of a bye, and that's sad because, of course, the Stanley Cup is a Canadian award by our former Governor General. So the fact that it's only going to competed amongst American teams this year is indeed a shame. But we'll do better next year. I want you to know that. Yeah, we'll try that. Just to get back, I'm reminded by the visit when Winston Churchill came to the United States and Canada on a lecture tour in the 1930s. He came up to Canada after having visited your country, and he said, "Well, Mr. Churchill," somebody asked him, how was your trip to the United States? What did you find?" And he growled out the answer, "The goddamn toilet paper was too thin and the newspapers were too fat." I'm sure there's a hockey analogy in there somewhere.
Way in the back.
Is this mic on? Thanks for being here. We really appreciate you taking time out to do this, everybody, including the International Affairs Forum. Question that I have, you mentioned the Atlantic and the Pacific, but there's the third coast that we have organizations here, even based in Traverse City, called For the Love of Water. Curious how resonant in the provinces, coast to coast in Canada, are issues related to the freshwater ocean that we share.
The Great Lakes.
I agree.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
No, is there a question?
Fresh water.
How aware are Canadians of the things that need to be addressed in the Great Lakes, including nuclear power stations, et cetera, et cetera?
The Great Lakes.
The Great Lakes,
The
yes. Well,
Preservation of the Great Lakes resource. Okay.
actually, we're probably more concerned than you might think we are. One of the problems, of course, or one of the challenges which comes up from time to time is the whole issue of water exports and whether cities adjacent to lakes can use the water from the lakes. Short answer to that is it happens. Can cities, 100 miles in from the lakes, tap water from the lakes? People are less sure about that. We're always a bit reluctant in Canada to open up our reservoirs, as it were, to export water to the United States. We have some very good mechanisms, for example, in the West on the Columbia River system, how that's jointly managed between the two countries. One of the things that we are keen on, of course, is maintaining the quality of the Great Lakes, and that's from invasive fish species that come in, the possible effects of leaky pipelines, like you have here in the Straits of Mackinac and that sort of thing. And one of the issues on the bilateral mechanism we have between our two countries, the International Joint Commission, I think it's going to be given a wider brief on the whole environmental front. So, safe shipping, environmental stuff, navigation. I understand there's some plan to, or some people want to expand farm fishing in the Great Lakes, and there's a great controversy over that, whether fish farms are good or bad. I mean, there are a couple of big ones that do lake trout, I think. Somebody had an idea that they wanted to start farming shrimp in the Great Lakes. I'm not too sure that's a great idea. Don't know. But, if you look at an ecosystem. But it's funny, here we are in 2016. When I served in Minnesota in the early 80s at our Consulate General in Minneapolis, the big issue then was acid rain, if you'll recall. And a lot of lakes through the upper Midwest, Canada, were being lost because of acidity and so on. That corrected itself over time. But I think the whole thing on the Great Lakes are too important to all of us for all sorts of reasons, recreation, commerce, that our eye is on the ball with the Great Lakes as much as yours is.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank David Collins.